I was evicted from my own home, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a thunderstorm, by the son I had sacrificed my whole life to raise. A small suitcase, a signed piece of paper I don't remember signing, and a blue card my husband left behind with his final instructions before he passed away. I am Evelyn Harper, 68, widowed, penniless, standing in the rain, but I haven't lost. If you're reading this story, like it, comment the city you're reading from so I know how far my story has come, and don't go anywhere because what happens next will change everything you think you know about family, about trust, and about how strong a woman can be. The rain started around 9 o'clock that evening, the kind that didn't build slowly but arrived all at once, sheets of it hammering the windows and drowning out every other sound in the house. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of tea I hadn't touched yet, watching the water run down the glass in crooked lines and thinking about Richard. That happened a lot those days. 6 months after his death, and I still reach for him constantly. Turned to say something in the car, started to call his name from the bottom of the stairs before I caught myself. Grief isn't clean. Nobody tells you that. It's not a stage you pass through. It's a room you live in, and sometimes the walls close in without warning. I heard Vanessa's heels on the hardwood before I saw her. She had a particular way of walking through rooms she'd decided belonged to her. Deliberate, unhurried, like she was taking inventory. She'd moved into the house 5 months earlier, right after the funeral, and from the first week she'd begun the slow process of rearranging things. My kitchen became her kitchen. My living room became a space where I needed to ask before I sat down in my own chair. My husband's study, where his books still smelled like him, became Vanessa's home office within 6 weeks of us lowering him into the ground. Evelyn. She said my name the way people say it when they've already decided the conversation is over. Daniel wants to talk to you in the living room. I'm having my tea. It won't take long. It never did with Vanessa. She had a way of making everything sound efficient and reasonable until you were already in the middle of it and couldn't find the exit. I set the cup down and followed her. Daniel was standing near the fireplace. He was 41 years old, my only child, and that night he looked like a man who had rehearsed something and was afraid he might forget his lines. He had Richard's height and none of Richard's steadiness. Where his father had been still, Daniel was always moving, fingers tapping, jaw tightening, eyes shifting to Vanessa every few seconds like she was the prompter standing just off stage. "Mom," he gestured to the sofa. "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." He glanced at Vanessa. "We need to talk about the house," she said. And there it was. She hadn't even let him start. "What about the house?" I said. "We've been talking to the estate attorney," Daniel said. "There are some things we didn't fully understand about Dad's will, about the way the property was structured." "I understood it perfectly," I said. "The house is mine. Your father made sure of that." Vanessa smiled. It was the smile she used when she thought you were being simple. "That's not quite what the paperwork shows, Evelyn. There are joint provisions that weren't explained to you properly at the time. We've had someone go through everything, and the situation is more complicated than you realize." "Who's someone?" "Our attorney." "Your attorney reviewed my husband's estate documents." "Our family's estate documents," she said. "We're all family here." I stood very still. Outside, the rain was getting heavier. "What exactly are you telling me?" I said. Daniel took a breath. "We think it would be best for everyone, for the estate, for the clarity of everything going forward, if you moved into the guest suite over at the Whitmore. It's a beautiful place. Private. You'd have everything you need." The Whitmore was a senior living facility 2 towns over. I had driven past it once. The parking lot was always empty. "You want me to move into a nursing home," I said. "It's not a nursing home. You want me to leave my house. Mom, the house your father built." My voice came out quieter than I expected, and I think that surprised all 3 of us. "The house where we raised you, where we buried your grandmother's ashes in the garden because she loved the roses. You want me to leave that house and go live in a facility." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The estate is complicated. We're trying to simplify." "No." I said it flat. "No. I am not going anywhere." Vanessa stepped forward. She had a folder in her hands that I hadn't noticed before, and she laid it on the coffee table between us like she was setting down a final verdict. "Evelyn, We had Dr. Morrison complete a cognitive evaluation last month. You mentioned to him that you were having trouble with dates, with managing your medications. I said I missed an appointment. That is not a cognitive evaluation. Dr. Morrison's assessment is that there are some concerns. Daniel is your next of kin. He has a responsibility. Daniel is my son, not my guardian. She smiled again, slower this time. That's something that may need to be revisited. That was the moment I understood what I was actually looking at. It wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. They had been building this for months, quietly, carefully, the way you build something you don't want anyone to see until it's already finished. I thought about the forms I'd signed in those foggy weeks after the funeral, the ones Daniel had brought me in stacks, patient and kind, explaining that they were routine estate matters, that my signature was just a formality, that Dad would have wanted things handled efficiently. I had trusted him. I had been drowning in grief, and I had trusted him, and I had signed. I thought about the bank statements I'd stopped receiving. We set up online access for you, Vanessa had said, showing me a tablet I didn't know how to use. Everything's there whenever you want it. But when I'd ask specific questions about specific amounts, the answers were always vague, always circled back to complexity, always ended with, "Let us handle it, Mom. That's why we're here." I thought about the medication, the little yellow pills my doctor had prescribed after I started having trouble sleeping, how Vanessa had quietly taken over managing them, how I'd felt slower than usual for months, heavier in my thoughts, like everything was happening through glass. I stood there in the living room of my own house, in the home Richard and I had filled with 40 years of living, and I understood for the first time that I had been very carefully, very deliberately dismantled. "I need to think," I said. "Of course," Vanessa said warmly. "Take your time. But Daniel and I feel that the sooner we can get things sorted, the better for everyone's peace of mind." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed Richard and I had shared for 38 years. His pillow still held the faintest trace of him, or maybe I only imagined it did because I needed it to. I sat there for a long time while the rain beat against the windows, and I thought about what I had just been told. And underneath the shock, underneath the hurt, something else was beginning to move. Something quiet and sharp that I hadn't felt in a long time. I got up and opened the drawer of Richard's nightstand. He had showed it to me once, 7 years before he died. "This is for later," he'd said, which wasn't like him. Richard dealt in the present, not in vague futures. "If something happens, if you ever need something you don't know you need." He had pressed a card into my hand. Blue, plain, no logo I recognized, a name and a number on the back in his handwriting. "What is this?" I'd asked. "Insurance," he said. "Not the kind you buy, the kind you build." I'd put it in the drawer and mostly forgotten about it. But that night, with the sound of Vanessa's heels still echoing in my memory, I opened the drawer and it was there. The blue card. Exactly where he'd left it. "When the time comes, trust the blue card." Those were the exact words he'd used, and I hadn't understood them until that moment. I held it in my hands for a while. Then I went to the closet and I started to pack. I didn't take much. One suitcase. The photographs I kept in the box on the shelf, not all of them, just the ones I couldn't leave behind. My jewelry, what was left of it. My own medications, which I'd been quietly stockpiling after I'd begun to suspect that the ones Vanessa gave me weren't quite what my prescription said. A set of documents I'd had the sense to photocopy the previous week, after overhearing a phone conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I had the suitcase packed and sitting by the bedroom door by 11:30. I went downstairs. Vanessa was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a glass of wine at her elbow. She looked up when I came in, and something passed over her face. A flicker of surprise, maybe. She'd expected me to fold. That was the thing about people like Vanessa. They were brilliant at reading weakness, and completely blind to the moment weakness ran out. "I'm leaving tonight," I said. She blinked. "Evelyn, I heard you talking earlier this week, on the phone." I watched her face change. "I don't know who you were talking to, but I heard enough. I know about the doctor's forms. I know what you're planning." "You're upset." "No." I set my keys on the counter. My house keys. "I'm clear. There's a difference. And I want you to know that I am walking out of this house tonight by my own choice. I am not confused, I am not incompetent, and whatever comes next, you will not be able to say I didn't understand what was happening. I picked up my suitcase and I walked to the front door. Daniel was at the top of the stairs. He'd come out of the study at some point and was standing there in the half-dark, watching me. He looked younger than 41 in that moment. He looked in a way that was almost painful to see, like the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table and eat cereal and ask me to check his homework. "Mom," he said. I looked up at him. I let the silence sit there between us. "I hope," I said quietly, "that you understand what you've let her turn you into." I didn't wait for an answer. I opened the front door. The rain hit me immediately. Cold, heavy, relentless. I walked to my car, put the suitcase in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the engine running and my hands on the wheel. My chest was tight, my eyes burned. I was not going to cry in that driveway. I was not going to give that house, or the people in it, that particular thing. I pulled out and drove. There was a motel 20 minutes from town, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and still had a vacancy sign in actual neon letters. The Lakeview Inn, though there was no lake visible from any of the windows. I paid for 3 nights in cash. I'd been keeping a small envelope of it hidden for 2 weeks, for reasons I couldn't have fully articulated, but that felt, in hindsight, like some deeper part of me had already known this night was coming. The room was small and smelled faintly of old carpet and the kind of cleaner that's supposed to hide it. The bedspread was brown. The heater rattled. There was a painting of a covered bridge on the wall above the bed, slightly crooked, and I didn't fix it. I sat on the edge of the bed with the blue card on the table beside me, and I did something I hadn't really allowed myself to do since Richard's funeral. I put my face in my hands and I cried. Not the quiet kind. Not the kind that's still holding itself together. The other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep and so old that it doesn't have a name, just a sound. I cried for Richard, for the way he'd been taken so fast, so suddenly, that I hadn't had time to prepare. One morning he was there, making coffee, and complaining about the weather forecast. And 3 days later I was standing in a funeral home, picking out a casket while someone offered me water in a paper cup. I cried for the months I'd spent drowning after that, reaching for a hand that wasn't there, making myself vulnerable in exactly the ways I'd never been allowed to be when he was alive, because he was always there to steady me. I cried for my son, for the Daniel I'd raised, and the one who had stood at the top of those stairs and let me walk out into the rain. And I cried for myself, for the woman who had signed papers she shouldn't have signed, and trusted people she shouldn't have trusted and let grief hollow her out until she was easier to move. It took a while. When it was done, I felt wrung out and raw, and underneath all of that, something else, something steady. I picked up the blue card. The name on the back was Richard's handwriting, small and careful, the way he always wrote things that mattered. Bridgewater Trust and Legacy. Private. Call first. And below it, a number with an out-of-state area code I didn't recognize. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at the clock. 1:47 in the morning. The bank wouldn't be open for hours. I set the card down on the nightstand and lay back on the brown bedspread and looked at the water stain on the ceiling. The rain had slowed to something quieter outside. The heater rattled. The covered bridge hung crooked on its nail. I thought about Richard. About a specific morning, maybe 8 years ago, when I'd found him sitting alone in the kitchen at 5 a.m. with a cup of coffee and a legal pad full of notes. He'd startled when he saw me, then laughed at himself. "What are you doing up?" I'd asked. "Thinking ahead," he'd said. "You know me." I did know him. That was the thing. I had known him for 42 years, and I knew that when Richard said he was thinking ahead, he meant it in the way that mattered. Not worry, not anxiety, but the quiet, methodical preparation of a man who understood that love wasn't only felt, it was built, it was planned for. It was left behind in ways you wouldn't fully understand until you needed them. When the time comes, trust the blue card. I closed my eyes. I didn't sleep much, but for the first time in months, I felt like myself. By 6 in the morning, I was dressed, sitting at the small desk by the window with a cup of bad motel coffee and a notepad I'd found in the drawer beside a Bible I pushed to the back. I was making a list, not a desperate list, not the kind you make in panic, grasping at anything that feels like action. This was methodical. This was Richard's influence. All those years of watching him sit down with a problem and simply organize it until it became manageable. What I knew, Daniel and Vanessa had been systematically gaining control of my access to my own finances for months. They had involved a doctor without my full knowledge or consent. They had retained an attorney to review estate documents. They had been living in my house, eating my food, using my accounts, and building what appeared to be a case for guardianship, the legal ability to make decisions for me, over me, without me. What I didn't know, how far along it was, whether legal documents had already been filed, whether the accounts had already been moved, whether there was anything left to fight for, or whether I had already lost it without knowing. And then there was the blue card. I wrote that at the bottom of the list and circled it twice. I'd trusted Richard with everything for 42 years. His judgment had been wrong before. He was human. He made mistakes. There were years that were hard and conversations that nearly broke us and decisions I disagreed with deeply. But this particular thing, this quiet, private, this is for later, this felt different. This felt like a man who had seen something coming and had prepared for it, not because he doubted me, but because he loved me enough to plan for a version of the future where I would need to fight. I thought about what Vanessa had said. The situation is more complicated than you realize. She had meant it as a threat. I was beginning to think she had no idea how right she was. The morning was cold and gray, the streets still wet from the night's rain. I drove into the center of town and found a diner that was open early and sat at the counter and ordered eggs I didn't really taste. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, hair pulled back, quick with the coffee refills. She didn't ask me anything personal, which I appreciated more than she knew. I watched the town wake up through the window. Delivery trucks, a man walking a dog who hadn't adjusted its pace for the weather, a woman jogging in a yellow raincoat, utterly committed. Ordinary. Ordinary Thursday morning for everyone except me. I turned the blue card over in my fingers. There was a woman in our neighborhood when Daniel was small. Margaret Holt. She'd been widowed young and then spent 15 years having her finances slowly eaten by a son and his wife, who smiled at her in public and spoke for her in private. By the time she understood what was happening, there was almost nothing left. I had brought her soup sometimes, sat with her in her kitchen while she tried to explain to me how it had happened so gradually, how each step had seemed reasonable at the time, how she'd kept telling herself it was family, and family didn't do things like that on purpose. I remembered thinking, and this was the thought that shamed me most when I remembered it now, I remembered thinking that I would never let something like that happen to me, that I would see it coming, that I was too sharp, too aware, too firmly in possession of myself. Pride. It was pride, plain and simple, and grief had cut right through it like it didn't exist. But I was awake now. I left a tip on the counter and I went back to the motel, and I waited for the bank to open, sitting in the parking lot with the engine running and the blue card in my hand and Richard's voice in my memory, as close as he'd been in months. When the time comes. The time had come, and I was not, as it turned out, someone who could be put in a facility and forgotten about. Richard had known that. Whatever he'd put behind this little blue card, whatever insurance, whatever foundation he'd been quietly laying, I was going to find it, and then I was going to use it. The bank opened at 9. I watched the lights come on through the glass doors from across the street. I counted to 10. I gathered myself. I got out of the car. The lobby was quiet that early, the kind of careful hush that banks have in the mornings before they fill up with the noise of the day. There were 2 tellers and a woman at a side desk who looked up when I came in with the particular attention of someone who's been trained to assess people at the door. I was 68 years old, wearing yesterday's clothes, no appointment, carrying a blue card that didn't look like anything she'd seen before, and I probably looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had spent the night in a motel room and hadn't slept more than 2 hours. I need to speak to someone about a trust account, I said. Private. My husband set it up. His name was Richard Harper. Something changed in her expression. It was slight, not alarmed, not even particularly surprised. Just a small recalibration, the way a face changes when it's made a quiet connection. "Of course," she said. "Can I have the card?" I handed it across the desk. She looked at it for a moment, then she stood up. "I'll get the branch manager." She said it with a kind of evenness that told me this was not the first time someone had come in with this card, that whoever Richard had been working with, they had prepared for this moment. They had expected at some point that someone would walk through that door wet and hollow and holding this small blue rectangle. They had expected me. The branch manager came out from the back. He was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, careful suit, expression of someone who had been briefed on something and was choosing his words accordingly. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I'm glad you came in." He extended his hand. "My name is Warren Elfield. I think your husband wanted very much for us to meet." I shook his hand. "He told me," Warren said carefully, "that when you came in, not if, when, he wanted me to make sure you understood everything completely. All of it. No simplification." I looked at him steadily. "Then let's sit down," I said, "and you can start from the beginning." He nodded. He led me back to his office. He closed the door. And the world I thought I'd lost began to show me what had been waiting beneath it all along. Warren Elfield's office was small and unremarkable. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out onto the parking lot rather than anything worth seeing. There was a framed photograph of 2 children on a hiking trail and a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Golfer" that someone had clearly given him as a joke. Nothing about it suggested that what was about to happen in this room would rearrange the entire architecture of my life. He closed the door, sat down, and folded his hands on the desk with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about this meeting. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "before I show you anything, I need to ask you a few questions. Standard verification. I hope you understand. Ask whatever you need." He asked me Richard's full name, his date of birth, our wedding anniversary, and the name of the street where we'd lived before we moved to the house on Callaway Drive. Each answer came easily. They were the bedrock facts of my life, the ones grief hadn't touched. When I finished, Warren nodded once and opened the drawer to his right. He placed a folder on the desk between us. "Your husband opened this account 11 years ago," he said. "It's structured as a protected discretionary trust. The legal name is the Harper Family Legacy Trust, but the account was flagged internally under a designation your husband chose, Blue Tier. That's what the card refers to." I looked at the folder but didn't reach for it yet. "How much?" I said. Warren didn't hesitate. "The current value of the trust, including accrued interest and investment returns over the past 11 years, is $7,342,000. The number sat in the air between us. I heard it clearly, I understood it. And then some part of my brain simply declined to accept it for a moment. The way you decline to accept something when the scale of it is too large for the ordinary container of a morning. "Richard never told me," I said. "He told me you'd say that." Warren allowed himself something close to a small smile. He said, and I'm quoting from a letter he left in the file, "Evelyn will think I should have told her sooner. She's right. But I also know her well enough to know that if she'd known about it, she would have been practical about it, and I wanted this to be something she'd find when she needed it most, not something we'd spend on a kitchen renovation." I put my hand over my mouth, just for a second, just to hold myself together while I heard my dead husband's voice come out of a stranger's mouth in a bank office on a gray Thursday morning. "He sounds like him," I managed. "He left a full letter," Warren said. "I'll give you that in a moment. But first I need to tell you something else, and it's not easy." I lowered my hand. "Tell me." 3 months ago, a man identifying himself as Daniel Richard Harper contacted this branch. He had documentation, power of attorney forms, medical assessments, correspondence from an attorney claiming to represent the estate. Warren's voice was even, careful, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, the restrained version of it. He attempted to access the trust. He presented the claim that you were no longer competent to manage your own affairs, and that as your legal guardian, he was authorized to assume control of the account. I didn't say anything. "We denied the request," Warren said. "The trust was structured specifically to prevent exactly that scenario. Your husband was very particular about the protections he built in. There is a clause that requires in-person verification from you specifically, not a representative, not a guardian, not a power of attorney, before any change can be made to the account's beneficiary structure or access permissions. The forged documents Daniel presented couldn't override that because the trust requires biometric verification alongside a specific access protocol. Forged, I said. The power of attorney your son presented contained your signature. Our legal team compared it to the signature on file from when your husband established the trust. They don't match, Mrs. Harper. The pressure differential is different. The loop in your capital E is different. Small things, but consistent across multiple points of comparison. He paused. We filed a report with the State Financial Crimes Unit 6 weeks ago. I sat back in my chair. Forged. My son had forged my signature. Or Vanessa had, and Daniel had carried the paper in and handed it across a desk with his father's name on a wall plaque and said, "She can't manage herself anymore. I need access to her accounts." My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway of the house on Maple Street and held while he cried when his first dog died. What else? I said, because I could feel there was more. Warren opened the folder and turned it to face me. These are the documents Daniel presented. I want you to look at them carefully because what he submitted wasn't just a power of attorney. He also presented this. It was a letter on medical letterhead. Dr. Alan Morrison, the same name Vanessa had dropped the previous night. The letter was 3 paragraphs, clinical in its language, and it described a patient, me, as exhibiting signs of progressive cognitive decline, impaired judgment, difficulty managing financial decisions, and emotional volatility inconsistent with the baseline personality profile of a competent adult. I read it twice. Then I set it down. Dr. Morrison has been my physician for 4 years, I said. I went to him after the funeral because I wasn't sleeping. He prescribed something for anxiety. I saw him twice. I understand. He never administered any cognitive test. He never once raised any concerns about my mental state to me directly. He asked me how I was doing, and I said I was struggling, and he wrote me a prescription. My voice was calm. I was aware of keeping it that way. This letter is a fabrication. Yes, Warren said simply. We believe so too. I stared at the letterhead. Dr. Alan Morrison, MD Family Practice and Geriatric Care. I thought about the little yellow pills, the ones Vanessa had managed so carefully, counted out each morning, placed beside my orange juice with a solicitous smile. I thought about how clouded I'd felt for months, how the edges of things had blurred, how I'd started to wonder sometimes if maybe they were right, maybe something was wrong with me, maybe I wasn't as sharp as I'd always been. I need to ask you something, I said to Warren, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. Is it possible that someone could have been slowly altering my medications to make me appear less competent, to make the symptoms described in that letter more plausible? He was quiet for a moment. That's not a question I can answer from where I sit, but it's a question you should be asking a doctor. One you choose yourself, not one that's been recommended to you recently. I nodded. I filed that away. Warren reached into the folder again and produced an envelope. My name on the front in Richard's handwriting. Just Evelyn, the way he'd always written it on birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter, slightly slanted, the letters leaning toward each other like they were telling a secret. He asked me to give you this when you came in, Warren said. He stood up. Take as long as you need. I'll get you some coffee, the real kind, not the lobby stuff. He left the room. I held the envelope in my hands for a moment. It was sealed. He'd pressed it closed himself years ago, and now I was sitting in a stranger's office in yesterday's clothes, and I was going to open it and hear from my husband for the first time since the funeral. I slid my finger under the flap. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated 4 years before his death. The handwriting was careful at the start and got slightly looser toward the end, the way his always did when he was writing from the heart rather than the head. Evelyn, he'd written, if you're reading this, then something has happened, and I'm not there, and I'm sorry for that in ways I don't have language for. I hope I was wrong to prepare for this. I hope this letter sits in Warren Elfield's drawer until we're both too old to read it, and then we burn it laughing at how cautious I was. But I know the people in our life. I know our son. And I love Daniel the way I love you, without conditions. But love without clear eyes is just hope wearing a blindfold, and I have never been good at being blind. I had to stop reading for a moment. I built the trust because I knew that grief changes the ground beneath a person. I knew that if I went first, you would be vulnerable in the months right after. Not because you're weak, you are one of the least weak people I have ever known, but because grief makes every familiar thing feel unreliable, and I didn't want anyone to take advantage of that unfamiliar ground. Warren has instructions. The trust is protected. No one can touch it without you standing there in person and giving the word. If Daniel is the reason you're reading this, forgive him if you can, but protect yourself first. Forgiveness is something you give when you're standing on solid ground. Get to solid ground. If Vanessa is involved, and my gut says she might be, trust your gut back. You always had better instincts than you gave yourself credit for. I have left more than money. Ask Warren about the second folder. He'll know what you mean. I love you. I always will. The rest is details. Richard. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat with it in my hands for a long moment. The framed hiking photograph watched me from the wall. The parking lot sat gray and unchanged outside the window. Warren came back with coffee. He set a mug in front of me and sat down without asking if I was all right, because he had the good sense to see I wasn't and that I didn't need to be asked. He mentioned a second folder, I said. Warren reached into the drawer again. The second folder was thicker. Inside were documents I hadn't expected. Account statements, transfer records, a series of correspondence between an attorney named Patricia Weil and Richard, spanning years. Patricia Weil, according to the business card clipped to the top of the file, was a specialist in elder financial law and estate protection. Your husband retained Ms. Well, 3 years before he died, Warren said. She has copies of everything in that folder. She's been waiting to hear from you. I looked down at the documents, bank statements from accounts I hadn't known existed, joint accounts that Daniel and Vanessa had apparently discovered and begun making inquiries about, transfer requests that had been blocked, correspondence from an attorney I didn't recognize making claims about Richard's estate on Daniel's behalf, claims that contradicted the actual terms of the will. And then, near the bottom of the stack, something that made my hands go still. It was a printout, an email exchange. The sender was Vanessa's personal email address, which I recognized because I'd seen it on the shared calendar she'd set up for the household after the funeral. The recipient was the unrecognized attorney, a man named Gerald Foss. The date was 2 months after Richard's death. The email was brief and efficient in the way that Vanessa did everything. Gerald, the Morrison assessment is progressing. Expect documentation within 6 weeks. Once guardianship petition is filed, we move on the primary account. Daniel's on board but needs management. Don't contact him directly. Everything through me. V. I read it 3 times. Daniel is on board but needs management. Not a partnership. Not a marriage where 2 people had decided together to do something terrible. An operation with Vanessa as its architect, and my son as a tool she'd calculated and deployed. I didn't know whether that made it better or worse. Both, maybe. Both at the same time. How did Richard get this? I asked. Ms. Weil had a contact in Gerald Foss's office, Warren said carefully. I don't know the details, but your husband had been gathering documentation for over a year before he died. He suspected something was being planned. He didn't know the timeline or the specifics, but he knew the shape of it. My husband had spent the last year of his life quietly, carefully building me an escape hatch. He'd been sick, and he'd been in pain, and he'd sat with attorneys and bankers and built a fortress around me while I made him soup and thought the worst was a disease. I need to call Patricia Weil, I said. I already let her assistant know you were here, Warren said. She's available whenever you're ready. Patricia Weil's voice on the phone was not what I expected. I'd imagined someone severe, someone with the clipped efficiency of a person who spent their days in depositions. Instead, she sounded like a woman in her late 50s who had seen a great deal and had stopped being shocked by any of it, which was its own kind of severity. Mrs. Harper, she said, Richard spoke about you constantly. He was very specific that when you called, I was to tell you immediately, you have more ground than they think you do. I'm beginning to see that. They filed a motion yesterday, she said. Emergency guardianship petition. Daniel Harper versus the estate of Richard Harper, naming you as the subject of the petition. She said it without softening it, which I respected. They're claiming cognitive impairment, inability to manage financial affairs, and emotional instability. They've included the Morrison letter and a supporting affidavit from Gerald Foss. Filed yesterday, I said. While they were sitting across from me in the living room telling me I should think about the Whitmore facility. Yes. They had already filed before they even spoke to me. Yes, Patricia said again. The conversation last night wasn't an offer. It was a formality. They were giving you the chance to go quietly before the court process began. I stood at the window of Warren's office and looked at the parking lot and breathed. A woman was loading groceries into her car with the careful efficiency of someone who had a long list of things to do today. Ordinary. Everything out there was ordinary. Patricia, I said, tell me what we have. She told me. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it I had filled 4 pages of the notepad Warren had given me. The trust was untouchable. The protections Richard had built in were so specifically designed that even a successful guardianship petition couldn't override the in-person verification clause. The forged power of attorney gave us a fraud claim. The email exchange gave us evidence of premeditation. The Morrison letter, combined with my own testimony and the prescription records I could obtain, gave us a foundation to challenge the medical assessment directly. There's one more thing, Patricia said. Richard's will. The actual, original will, not whatever version Gerald Foss has been representing to the courts. The house on Callaway Drive is yours outright. No joint provisions, no shared ownership. Whatever Daniel and Vanessa told you about complex estate structures was fabricated. The house is yours. My house, that I had walked out of in the rain with a single suitcase because I had trusted what they told me. I want to go back, I said. Not yet. Patricia's voice was firm. If you go back now, you're walking into a situation where a legal petition is already in motion. We need to be strategic. We need to build before we move. Can you stay where you are for a few more days? I'm in a motel. I know. I'm sorry. I'll make some calls. So there's a short-term rental available through someone I trust. Clean, private, no connection to anyone in your family's circle. You'll be more comfortable. I'm not worried about comfortable, I said. I'm worried about the house. The house isn't going anywhere. Daniel can't sell it. He can't transfer it. He has no legal authority over it regardless of what he's been told by Foss. Sit tight, Mrs. Harper. We're going to handle this properly. I hung up and sat for a moment with the notepad in my hands. The morning had started with me sitting in a diner eating eggs I couldn't taste, holding a card that might mean nothing. Now I was sitting in a bank manager's office with a trust worth more than $7 million, and a lawyer who had been waiting for me, and an email that proved my daughter-in-law had been orchestrating this for months. The ground beneath my feet had shifted completely. Not back to what it had been. That version of things was gone, and I was clear-eyed enough to know it. But to something else. Something harder. Warren walked me out at noon. The sun had come out while I was inside, pale and uncertain. The kind of sunshine that follows a heavy rain and doesn't quite commit to warmth. Mrs. Harper, he said at the door. Richard was in this office every year for the last decade of his life. He updated the trust documents, checked the protections, asked about every contingency. He paused. He talked about you every time, not in the way people talk about their spouses as a social formality. He talked about you like you were the whole reason for the exercise. I didn't trust myself to respond to that, so I just nodded. He was right about one thing, Warren said. What's that? He said when you finally walked in here, you'd come in ready. He said the one thing he was never worried about was whether you could handle it. I drove back to the motel. I sat in the parking lot and I looked at the notepad full of evidence and at Richard's letter on the passenger seat. And I thought about Daniel standing at the top of those stairs the night before, watching me leave, saying nothing. Daniel is on board but needs management. He was my son. He was also someone who had sat across a desk from a banker and handed over a document with my forged signature on it. Both things were true. They didn't cancel each other out. I opened my phone. I had 3 missed calls from Daniel and 1 text from Vanessa that said simply, "We're here to talk whenever you're ready." I put the phone back in my bag without answering. Somewhere in a courthouse, a petition with my name on it was sitting in a filing system, waiting for a judge to review it. My son and his wife had gone to bed the previous night in my house, in the silence after I'd driven away, probably believing that the hard part was over, that the rest would follow smoothly. The legal process, the accounts, the property, the tidy disappearance of an old woman who didn't know what she was sitting on. They had no idea what Richard had built. They had no idea what I was about to do. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. Patricia Weil had calls to make, and so did I. There was a private investigator she'd mentioned, someone who had worked on 3 cases like mine in the past 2 years, who knew how to document financial manipulation in ways that were admissible and persuasive and very, very hard to argue against in a courtroom. My hands were steady on the wheel. For the first time in 6 months, I felt like myself. Not the self that grief had carved down to almost nothing. The earlier self. The one who could walk into a room and read it completely. The one Richard had loved for 42 years and trusted enough to build a fortress around. The sun pushed through the clouds for a moment, fully this time, and the wet road ahead of me lit up like something had just been switched on. Patricia Weil had warned me that the hearing would be uncomfortable. That was the word she used, uncomfortable, which I'd understood to be a careful understatement from a woman who had spent 20 years in courtrooms and had calibrated her language accordingly. What she meant, I think, was that sitting in a room while your own son's attorney argued that you were no longer capable of managing your life was a specific kind of pain that no amount of legal preparation could fully cushion. She was right. But she had underestimated me, which was something people had been doing for 6 months, and which I had stopped apologizing for. The 9 days between leaving the bank and walking into that courtroom were the most concentrated period of my life. Patricia moved fast. The private investigator she'd mentioned, a woman named Carol Sutter, mid-50s, former fraud examiner for the State Insurance Commission, with the patient eyes of someone who had learned to wait for the moment a story revealed itself, was in my borrowed rental apartment within 48 hours of my first call. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a recorder and a legal pad, and she asked me to walk her through every financial interaction I could remember from the past year, starting the week after Richard's funeral. I talked for 3 hours. Carol asked questions that I hadn't thought to ask myself, about timing, about which documents had arrived when, about who had been in the room when I signed, about whether I'd been given time to read anything or whether it had always been handed to me mid-conversation when my attention was on something else. By the time we finished, I understood that what I had experienced wasn't careless exploitation. It had been staged, sequenced. Each step had been designed to come when I was most off balance. A signature request 3 days after the funeral, a financial form the week I'd had a bad fall on the back porch and been shaken and distracted, the medication management offered during the 1 month when I'd told Daniel I felt like I was losing my grip on ordinary things. Vanessa had been watching me, cataloging my vulnerable moments and filing them away for later use. "She's smart," Carol said, not admiringly, just factually. "Yes," I said. "She is. Smart people leave more evidence than stupid ones. They document things. They send emails when they should call. They believe they're untouchable, so they stop being careful." She clicked her pen. "Give me a week." Carol gave me 6 days and came back with a file that made Patricia Weil go quiet for a full 30 seconds, which, based on what I'd learned of Patricia, was extraordinary. The file contained the email exchange Warren Elfield had shown me, now formally obtained through the Financial Crimes Unit's discovery process. It contained bank records showing 3 separate attempts by Daniel to access accounts in my name, using the forged power of attorney, not just the trust, but 2 checking accounts and a brokerage account Richard had held jointly with me. It contained a recording, legally obtained, Carol was precise about that, of a phone call between Vanessa and Gerald Foss in which Vanessa said, with the calm efficiency of someone ordering takeout, that the Morrison letter needed to be backdated to appear as though the evaluation had occurred 6 months earlier than it actually had. Backdated. A fraudulent medical letter, fraudulently dated, submitted to a court as evidence. And there was one more thing in Carol's file, something I hadn't expected, and that sat in my chest like a stone when I read it. Among the financial records, there were receipts, purchases made from a secondary account linked to my name, an account I hadn't known existed, that had been opened. Carol had traced it carefully, using a combination of my social security number and a signature that matched none of my known signature samples. The account had been active for 7 months. It had been used to pay for things: a 2-week vacation to Portugal, a set of furniture for the master bedroom at Callaway Drive, a series of transfers to a personal account in Vanessa's name. They had been spending money in my name, money they had manufactured the authority to access, and they had been doing it since before Richard was 6 weeks in the ground. I sat with that for a night. I sat with the specific arithmetic of it, that while I had been drowning in grief, while I had been lying awake in our bed, missing him in ways that had no floor to them, someone had been using my name to pay for a hotel in Lisbon. In the morning, I called Patricia and told her I was ready. The emergency guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, not the grand paneled room of television dramas, but a functional, slightly tired space with fluorescent lighting and chairs that had been recovered at some point in a fabric that had since faded to an indeterminate gray. The judge was a woman named Harriet Combs, 60-something, with reading glasses on a chain and the contained, evaluative stillness of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by anything presented to her. I sat at the respondent's table with Patricia to my left and Carol's file between us, and I watched Daniel and Vanessa come in with Gerald Foss. I had not seen them since the night I'd walked out. 9 days. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept well. There were shadows under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that I recognized because Richard had carried the same tension when he was under pressure. The Harper jaw, I used to call it, that particular tightening that meant something was costing more than expected. He didn't look at me when he sat down. Vanessa did. She looked at me with the calm, assessing gaze of someone calculating distances, and then she arranged her expression into something composed and turned away. Gerald Foss was exactly what his emails had suggested. A man shaped by years of telling people what they wanted to hear. Polished suit, practiced sympathy, the kind of voice that rounded every hard edge. He opened with Daniel's petition in the measured tone of someone presenting a humanitarian concern rather than a legal power grab. "Your Honor," he said, "Daniel Harper brings this petition out of genuine filial concern for his mother, Evelyn Harper, who has been displaying a pattern of behaviors consistent with cognitive decline in the months following the death of her husband. We have a medical assessment from her treating physician, Dr. Alan Morrison, indicating significant impairment in the areas of financial judgment and emotional regulation. We have evidence of erratic decision-making, including Mrs. Harper's voluntary departure from the family home in the middle of the night during a severe storm. We are asking only that the court act to protect a vulnerable adult." Voluntary departure. That was what they were calling it. Not, we presented her with a fait accompli in her own living room and expected her to fold. Voluntary departure. I wrote the words on the notepad in front of me and drew a line under them. Patricia stood up. She was not a dramatic woman. She didn't have the courtroom theatrics of the lawyers I'd seen on television. The pauses, the strategic glances, the performed indignation. She was precise and she was quiet, and she had the particular authority of someone who knew exactly how much more she knew than the person across from her. "Your Honor," she said, "the respondent, Evelyn Harper, opposes this petition in its entirety and will demonstrate that the petition itself is the product of a coordinated scheme to defraud Mrs. Harper of her assets. We will show that the medical assessment presented by the petitioner was fabricated, that signatures submitted to this court and to financial institutions in Mrs. Harper's name were forged, and that the petitioner and his spouse engaged in a multi-month campaign of financial manipulation targeting a grieving widow. We ask that the petition be dismissed, and we will be filing cross-claims with this court today." Gerald Foss didn't move, but something in Vanessa's posture changed, a fraction, almost invisible, like a building that has absorbed a vibration it wasn't designed for. The judge looked at Patricia over her reading glasses. "Counsel, those are significant allegations." "We have documentation for every one of them, Your Honor." Judge Combs studied her for a moment. "Then let's proceed." What followed was 4 hours of testimony and evidence presentation, and I will not pretend it was clean or easy or that I sat there feeling powerful. There were moments when Patricia was presenting documents, and I had to look at the table because the content was too specific, too particular to the intimate architecture of my grief and how it had been used against me, to witness without losing my composure. There was a moment when the bank's legal representative confirmed on the stand that the power of attorney Daniel had presented contained a forged signature, and I heard Daniel make a sound beside his attorney, a short exhaled sound like the first step of a very long fall, and I had to press my hands flat on the table to stay still. Gerald Foss fought. He was good at what he did, which made it worse and also, in a strange way, easier. A skilled opponent makes you sharper, pulls you out of your feelings and into your strategy. He challenged the chain of custody of the email records. He argued that the signature analysis was inconclusive. He presented Daniel on the stand as a devoted son who had been misled by bad legal advice and had acted, however imperfectly, from a place of genuine care. Then Patricia called Carol Sutter. Carol was the kind of witness who made attorneys nervous because she spoke without theater. She stated facts the way other people state the time of day, flatly, with total confidence, connected to each other in a chain that didn't leave room for reinterpretation. She walked through the financial records with the unhurried patience of someone who has done this many times and knows that the numbers don't need embellishment. She presented the account opened in my name, the purchases, the transfers to Vanessa's personal account, the 3 attempts on the trust. When she produced the recording of Vanessa's phone call with Foss, the one where Vanessa discussed backdating the Morrison letter, the courtroom went the specific kind of quiet that isn't peaceful at all. It's the quiet that happens when a room full of people hears something that changes the shape of everything. Foss objected. The judge overruled him with a single word and told Carol to continue. Vanessa's voice came out of the speaker in Carol's laptop, clear, efficient, utterly recognizable. The Morrison letter needs to be backdated to appear as though the evaluation occurred 6 months earlier. I sat and listened to it and felt many things at once, none of them clean, none of them simple. Rage, yes, but underneath it something sadder and more complicated. The feeling of looking at a person you had shared a dining room table with for years and understanding that the version of them you had known was a performance so committed and complete that you had never once seen through it. Daniel looked at his wife. I watched him do it. I watched him turn and look at Vanessa, and I watched the specific moment when he understood fully the scope of what he had been part of. His face went through something complicated. Denial, then recognition, then something that wasn't quite shame but was adjacent to it. Vanessa did not look back at him. She was looking at the table in front of her with the total absence of expression that I now recognized as her default mode when she was calculating her next move. She had been calculating since the moment this started. She was calculating now. Gerald Foss requested a short recess. Judge Combs granted 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, I sat with Patricia in the hallway on a bench that was harder than it looked, and Patricia said very quietly, "We have them." "I know," I said. "How are you doing?" I thought about it honestly. "I've felt worse," I said. "I've also felt better." She nodded. "That's about right for where we are." When we went back in, Gerald Foss made a motion to withdraw the guardianship petition. He presented it with the careful language of someone trying to limit damage, a strategic retreat dressed as a procedural concession. Judge Combs looked at him over her glasses for a long moment. "Counsel," she said, "this court has just heard evidence of forged legal documents, fraudulent medical assessment, financial fraud, and a recorded conversation suggesting deliberate falsification of court evidence. The withdrawal of the petition does not resolve those matters." "Your Honor, I'm not finished." Her voice was patient and final in the way that genuine authority is, not loud, not theatrical. "This court will be referring the evidence presented today to the State Attorney General's office and to the Financial Crimes Division. Additionally, I am confirming today, for the record and for the benefit of all parties present, that the estate of Richard Harper, as established by his original will, vests all primary assets, including the property at Callaway Drive, solely in Evelyn Harper. Any claims to the contrary made by any party are without legal foundation and will be treated accordingly. She took her glasses off and set them on the bench. "Mrs. Harper," she said, looking directly at me for the first time. "I'm sorry you had to be here today." I met her eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor." It was over in the time it took to say those words. Legally, structurally, the thing that Daniel and Vanessa had built over months of careful, cruel planning collapsed in a single afternoon in a room with bad lighting and gray chairs. The petition was gone. The house was mine. The trust was mine. The evidence was in the hands of people whose job was to decide what happened next. In the hallway afterward, Daniel tried to reach me. He came out of the courtroom ahead of Vanessa, and I could see from across the corridor that he was going to say something, that he had gathered himself for it, the way you gather yourself for something you've been dreading. I stopped walking. I waited. He came toward me with his hands at his sides and his face doing that complicated thing it had been doing all day. "Mom," he said. "Daniel." "I need you to know." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know all of it. I know that doesn't—" "You signed documents," I said. "You walked into Warren Elfield's bank and handed them a forged signature and told them I was incompetent." He flinched. "I know." "You let her run this entire thing, and you told yourself it was for my benefit." "I know," he said again, and his voice broke on it slightly, which I noticed and did not allow to move me. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I know what I did." "Then you also know," I said quietly, "that what you did is not something I can dismiss because you're standing in a hallway looking sorry." He didn't say anything. "Go home, Daniel, wherever home is now." I turned and walked back to where Patricia was waiting. Vanessa was nowhere. I scanned the corridor, and she was already gone. Had slipped out, as she always did, the moment the calculation shifted against her. She had seen the referral to the Attorney General coming, and she'd made the decision that the smart move was distance, and she'd moved without a word to the man she'd married. Daniel is on board but needs management. He'd been managed right up until the moment he became inconvenient, and then he'd been left standing in a courthouse hallway. Patricia walked me to my car. The afternoon had gone pale and cold, the sun already low. "What now?" I said. "Now we let the system do what it's supposed to do," Patricia said. "The financial crimes referral will take time. But you have your house, you have your trust, you have everything Richard left you." "And Daniel?" She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a legal question." "No," I said. "It isn't." I drove back to the rental apartment. I made tea. I actually drank this time. I sat at the kitchen table with Richard's letter in front of me, and I read the last paragraph again. "Forgiveness is something you give when you're standing on solid ground. Get to solid ground." I was standing on it now. The ground was hard and cold and completely mine. What I did next with it, that was the question I wasn't ready to answer. Not today. Today had been enough. Outside the window, the streetlights were coming on one by one in the early dark, and the neighborhood was doing its ordinary evening things, and I sat in the kitchen of a borrowed apartment and understood for the first time in 6 months that the future was mine to decide. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. Patricia called me on a Saturday morning, 4 days after the hearing, while I was sitting on the small balcony of the rental apartment with coffee and the particular stillness that follows the end of something enormous. The legal machinery was still turning. It would turn for months, she'd warned me, the Attorney General's referral and the financial crimes investigation moving at the pace of institutions rather than people. But the immediate battle was finished, and I had been living in the unfamiliar quiet of its aftermath. "Vanessa's gone," Patricia said. "Her attorney contacted Foss's office yesterday to formally disassociate from the petition. She's left the state. Gerald Foss withdrew from Daniel's representation this morning." I set down my coffee. "Where did she go?" "Her family is in Arizona, that's the last known. But Mrs. Harper, she's going to be dealing with the Attorney General's office regardless of where she is. The recording alone is enough for obstruction and fraud charges. Running doesn't help her." I thought about Vanessa packing her things in my house. In the master bedroom with the furniture she'd bought on my fraudulent account. In the kitchen she'd colonized. In Richard's study where she'd set up her office. I thought about her doing it efficiently, without sentiment, the way she did everything. Calculating what to take, what to leave, which of the two people in that marriage was now a liability. "And Daniel?" I asked. He's still at the house. A pause. He's called my office twice. He's asking if you'll meet with him. I didn't say anything immediately. That's your decision entirely, Patricia said. There's no legal obligation either way. I know, I said. I'll think about it. I thought about it for 2 more days. I wasn't stalling out of cruelty. I genuinely didn't know what I wanted from a conversation with my son or what I had to give. There was a version of the meeting I could imagine where it was cathartic, where Daniel said the right things in the right order, and I felt some of the weight lift. But I'd spent 68 years on this earth, and I understood that those versions of things mostly existed in movies, and that real conversations between real people who had really hurt each other were messier and less satisfying, and rarely ended with everyone feeling resolved. But I also knew I couldn't leave it alone. Whatever Daniel was or wasn't, he was my son, and there were things that needed to be said. Not for his comfort, and not entirely for mine, but because some truths need to be spoken out loud into the specific air between the people they concern. Writing them in a journal doesn't do it. Rehearsing them in the shower doesn't do it. They need to be said face to face with the other person present and unable to pretend they didn't hear. I called Patricia and told her to arrange it. We met at the house on Callaway Drive on a Tuesday afternoon. I had not been back since the night I'd left, and pulling into the driveway produced a feeling I hadn't anticipated. Not the homecoming warmth I'd imagined, but something more complicated. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just different inside it now. The roses my husband had planted along the front walk were overgrown. Nobody had been tending them. Daniel opened the door before I knocked. He'd been watching for me. He looked worse than he had at the courthouse. Not dramatically worse, not broken in any visible way, but worn down. Like a person who had not been sleeping and had not been eating regularly and had been sitting alone in a house with a lot of time to think. He stepped back to let me in. I walked through the door of my own house. Patricia had advised me to bring her, but I'd said no. This part was not a legal matter. This part was between me and my son in the house his father built, and attorneys had no place in it. The living room was different. Vanessa had left quickly enough that she hadn't taken much. A few things were visibly absent, spaces on the shelves, a missing lamp, but her presence was still stamped on the room in the way she'd rearranged it in those first months. The furniture at different angles, the art on different walls. My chair had been moved to a corner. I walked over and moved it back without saying anything about it. Daniel watched me do it. "Do you want coffee?" he said. "No." I sat down. He sat across from me. There was a moment of silence that lasted long enough to have its own weight. "She's gone," he said. "I know. She left while I was at the store. I came back and her things were mostly cleared out. She left a note." He stopped. "It said she was protecting herself and that I should do the same." I looked at him. He looked at the floor. "Did that surprise you?" I asked. He took a long breath. "No," he said. "Not really, not after the hearing." He rubbed the back of his neck the way he'd done since he was a teenager, the gesture unchanged by 20 years. "I think part of me knew, even before the hearing, that there was a point where He didn't finish the sentence. "Where she'd decide you were the liability," I said. He flinched. "Yeah." "Daniel," I made myself wait until he looked at me. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Not the version that makes you look better. The actual truth." "Okay." "When did you know? Not about all of it. I don't think you knew all of it. But when did you know that what you were doing was wrong?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The bank. When Warren Elfield turned us down." He looked at his hands. "Vanessa said it was a procedural issue, that we'd resolve it, that Dad had set things up in a confusing way, and we just needed the right documentation. But the way the bank handled it, they weren't confused, they were refusing. There's a difference, and I could see it, and I told myself I didn't." He paused. "I let myself not know. That's different from not knowing. I want to be accurate about that." Something moved in me at that. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but recognition. He was telling the truth. I could hear it the same way I'd always been able to hear the difference in him between truth and performance, since he was a small boy. Why? I said. That's the part I can't get to. We weren't struggling, Daniel. You had a good job. You had a house. You didn't need my money. It wasn't about needing it, he said. It was... He stopped, and I watched him wrestle with something real. Vanessa talked about security a lot. The future. What might happen? What could go wrong? She had this way of making you feel like whatever you had was never quite enough. Like there was always a threat just over the horizon. And she'd frame it as us, as our future. And somewhere along the way I stopped. He shook his head. I stopped asking whose future she actually meant. You stopped asking whose interests she actually had in mind. Yes. And mine didn't register. He looked up. His eyes were wet, which I noticed, and which I didn't allow to change what I needed to say. You are my son, I said. You have been my son for 41 years. I drove you to school in the rain and sat with you in the emergency room when you broke your collarbone, and I was in the front row when you graduated, and I have loved you through everything, every stupid mistake, every bad decision, every year when you were too busy to call. I have loved you without accounting for it, and you used that, maybe not as coldly as Vanessa did, but you used it. I know, he said. The words came out rough. You used my grief. You used the worst months of my life when I couldn't find the floor, and you used them to build something against me. I kept my voice even. It cost me something to do that, but I paid it. I want you to sit with that, not explain it, not apologize for it right now, not tell me about Vanessa's influence. Sit with it. He nodded. He looked like a man sitting with something heavy, which was exactly right. I stood up and walked to the window. The garden looked ragged. The roses needed cutting back. The beds were full of autumn debris. The whole thing had the look of something that had stopped being tended. Richard had spent hours in that garden. It had been one of the few places he'd moved slowly, unhurried, paying attention. Your father knew, I said without turning around. Not everything. But he knew the shape of it. He built protections because he knew the shape of it, and he never said a word to me, and I think about that sometimes. What it cost him to know something like that about his son and carry it alone. Daniel didn't say anything. He loved you, I said. He never stopped, but he also didn't let love make him stupid about what was real. I turned back to face him. I want you out of this house, I said. That's not a negotiation, and it's not a punishment. It's just true. I need to come back to my home, and I cannot do that while you're in it. He nodded immediately. I know. I'll go. I want the key. He got up and went to the kitchen. I heard a drawer open and close. He came back and held out the house key. The spare I'd given him 3 years ago, before all of this, when I'd asked him to feed the cat while we were away. I took it. I'm not telling you there's nothing left between us, I said. I'm telling you that what's left has to be rebuilt, and rebuilding it is not my job. That's yours. If you mean what you're telling me today, then go prove it somewhere that isn't this room. What does that look like? He asked. I don't know yet. I need time, and I need distance, and I need to not be managing your redemption on top of everything else. You're 41 years old. Figure it out. He nodded. He looked for a moment very much like the boy in the old photographs upstairs. Not the smooth adult version, but the child version. The one who used to cry at movies and bring me dandelions and ask too many questions at bedtime. I felt the pull of that, the maternal gravity of it, the way it never fully switched off no matter what happened. I didn't reach for him, but I didn't walk away either. I'll need 2 days to arrange somewhere, he said quietly. I don't have... He paused. I don't have a lot of options right now. 2 days, I said. That's fine. I went back to the door. Daniel followed at a distance, giving me room, which was the right thing to do even if it came a year too late. At the threshold, I stopped. There was something I'd been carrying since the night I'd left, a specific question that had no legal dimension, that no attorney or investigator could answer, and that I needed to hear from him directly. The medication, I said. The yellow pills Vanessa was managing for me. Did you know what she was doing with them? He was very still. I didn't know at the start, he said. I noticed you seemed. He seemed to struggle with the word. I noticed you seemed slower, more uncertain. I told myself it was the grief. And later, a longer pause. This was the edge of something, and we both knew it. I asked her once, he said, 3 months in. I said you seemed different, and I asked if the pills were right. She said Dr. Morrison had adjusted the dosage because grief can affect how medication works, that it was normal. He looked at me steadily. I let her answer satisfy me. You let it satisfy you? Yes. I stood with that. He'd known something was wrong, and he'd accepted an explanation designed to close the question. That wasn't the same as participating in what Vanessa had done. But it wasn't innocent either. It was the choice to not know, repeated over months. The choice that let everything else happen. All right, I said. I walked out to my car. I sat in the driveway for a moment before I started the engine. The afternoon light was falling across the front of the house the way it had fallen every autumn for as long as I could remember. The particular gold of October light that Richard had always called the best version of any day. He used to make coffee and bring it out to the front steps and just sit in it. I pulled out of the driveway. 3 days later, Daniel was gone. He left a note on the kitchen table, short, handwritten, not asking me for anything. He said he'd arranged to stay with a friend from work. He said he'd filed a formal withdrawal of all remaining legal claims with Patricia's office. He said he was sorry, which I'd expected, and then he said something I hadn't. I'm going to spend a long time figuring out how I became someone who would do this. I don't expect that to matter to you right now, but I needed to say it exists. I read the note twice. I put it on the counter and made coffee, and went out to the garden with my cup. The roses were a mess, overgrown canes crossing each other, dead wood mixed in with the live growth, the whole structure tangled from months of neglect. I put down my coffee and went to the garage and found Richard's pruning gloves where he'd always kept them, hanging on the second hook to the left. I put them on. They were too big. His hands had always been larger than mine, but I pulled them on anyway and went back to the roses. I worked for 2 hours. It was hard work. My back felt it, my hands felt it, and I nicked myself twice through the heavy gloves because I was impatient and pushed too close to the thorns. But when I stopped, I could see the shape of what Richard had planted underneath the mess. The structure was still there. The roots were intact. Given care, given the right season, it would come back. I stood back and looked at it and thought about all the things that statement could apply to. Inside, I called Patricia and told her I was ready to begin the next conversation. The one about the house itself, about what came next, about whether the place I'd spent 40 years of my life was still the place where I wanted to spend whatever came after. That was a conversation I hadn't been ready for until today. I was ready now. The gloves went back on the hook. Richard's hook, the second one from the left, exactly where he'd always kept them. Outside, the October light was doing its best work of the day. The decision to sell the house did not come all at once. It arrived the way most honest decisions do. Gradually, quietly, over a series of mornings where I stood in different rooms and felt the weight of what each one held, and asked myself whether that weight was something I wanted to carry forward or something I needed to set down. I had gone back to Callaway Drive with every intention of reclaiming it. That was what I'd told myself in the motel room, in Warren Elfield's office, in the hallway outside the courtroom. The house is mine. I'm going back. It had felt like a principle, like the house itself was the measure of whether I'd won or lost. But principles and actual living are different countries, and once I was back inside those walls, really back, alone, with Daniel gone, and Vanessa's ghost still in the rearranged furniture and the bedroom she'd repainted a color I'd never chosen, I began to understand that what I'd been fighting for was never really the house. It was the right to decide what happened to it. That's a different thing entirely. Patricia came by one afternoon about 3 weeks after I'd moved back in. I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table, and I told her I was thinking about selling. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She asked practical questions, timeline, price expectations, whether I had somewhere in mind to go. And I found that having practical questions to answer made the decision feel real in a way that just thinking about it hadn't. There's a town, I said. Millhaven. About 2 hours north. Richard and I drove through it once, maybe 15 years ago, on the way back from visiting his sister. It had a lake. I remember thinking it was the kind of place where people actually lived rather than just accumulated things. I paused. I don't know why I remembered it. I just did. Patricia looked at me over her cup. That sounds like enough of a reason. The house sold in 6 weeks. The market was better than I'd expected, and the buyers were a young family. 2 children, a third apparently on the way, a dog that had bounded through the front door during the showing and gone directly to Richard's garden as though it already knew where it belonged. I took that as a sign, which was not like me, but grief and survival change the way you read things. I kept almost nothing from the house. The photographs, Richard's letter, the pruning gloves still too big, still hanging in my mind on that second hook, a quilt my mother had made that had lived on the back of the armchair in our bedroom for 30 years. The small things, the things that carried him without being about the place he'd lived in. Everything else I let go. Moving to Millhaven was not simple or romantic. I want to be honest about that. I arrived in November, which is not the ideal month to fall in love with a lakeside town. The lake was gray and choppy, the trees were bare, and the charming main street I'd remembered from 15 years ago was half boarded up from a construction project that the hardware store owner told me had been almost finished for 2 years. My rental cottage had a heating system that functioned at roughly 60% capacity and a kitchen faucet that dripped regardless of how firmly you closed it. I lay awake the first night listening to that drip and I thought, this is the beginning. Not the romantic version of a beginning, not the clean slate feeling the movies would have you expect. Just a woman in a cold cottage in a gray November town, 68 years old, starting over from a position no one would have chosen. It was still a beginning. That mattered. I found a plumber for the faucet. I called the heating company and argued with them until they sent someone who actually fixed the problem, rather than assessing it for future reference. I bought heavy curtains and a better blanket and learned which burner on the stove ran hot. I found a grocery store with a good produce section and a coffee shop run by a man named Pete, who had been in Millhaven for 30 years and knew everything about everyone and shared none of it unless you specifically asked, which I respected enormously. Slowly, the town revealed itself to me the way places do when you're paying attention rather than just passing through. The lake in the mornings, before the wind came up, had a stillness that was unlike anything I'd known in the suburbs. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of presence, of something large and unhurried existing at its own pace. I started walking the shore path every morning. Not for exercise, though the exercise was welcome. Just to be in it. To let the morning be the morning without anything being required of me. It was during those walks that the idea for the Harper Initiative began to take shape. It started as something smaller, a thought I'd had during the final days of the legal process, when Carol Sutter had mentioned that the Financial Crimes Unit was working 3 other cases almost identical to mine, all involving older adults, all involving family members, all involving the same slow, patient accumulation of control disguised as care. 3 cases at once, in one division of one city. How many of these do you see? I'd asked her. More than people think, she'd said, and most of them don't have what you had. Most of them don't have a Richard. I'd thought about Margaret Holt, my neighbor from years ago, the woman who'd brought me soup and tried to explain how it happened so gradually. She hadn't had a Richard either. She hadn't had a blue card in a nightstand drawer. She'd had a son who smiled at her in public, and by the time she understood what was gone, the account was empty and the house was in his name and there was nothing left to fight with. What if she'd known earlier? What if someone had told her, not in the abstract, not in a pamphlet, but concretely, practically, what to watch for? What if she'd had access to an attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of exploitation before she needed to fight it? What if there had been somewhere to go with the first nagging feeling that something was wrong, before wrong became catastrophic? I started making notes on my morning walks, not formal notes, just thoughts I'd dictate into my phone because writing while walking was beyond my coordination. Ideas about what such an organization might do. Education programs for older adults and their communities. Legal referrals. A hotline staffed by people who understood the specific dynamics of family-based financial exploitation, who wouldn't dismiss the call as a family dispute or suggest that surely the family had good intentions. I brought the notes to Patricia in December. She read through them at her kitchen table. I'd driven the 2 hours down to the city to see her, And when she finished, she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Something beyond her usual contained professionalism, something that was simply, plainly, moved. "You know this is real," she said. "This isn't a retirement hobby. This is a real organization." "I know. It will take work. It will take money. I have money. It will take your time and your energy and your name. And your name comes with a story that is going to be public in ways that might not always be comfortable." "Patricia," I said, "I was pushed out of my house in the rain by my own son while my husband had been dead for 6 months. I am not particularly frightened of discomfort." She laughed at that. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it was a good laugh, genuine and sudden, the kind that escapes before you decide to let it out. "All right," she said, "let's build it." The Harper Initiative was formally established the following spring. Patricia handled the legal structure and connected me with a board of directors. 3 people she trusted, 2 of whom turned out to become among the most important people in my life in the years that followed. We opened a small office in the city, kept the Millhaven cottage as my home, and spent the first 6 months doing the foundational work that nobody sees, building the referral network, establishing the legal partnership program, training the hotline staff, developing the educational materials that would eventually reach community centers and senior living facilities and libraries across 3 states. I told my story publicly for the first time at a community forum in March. I'd rehearsed it, edited it, prepared for the specific discomfort of saying out loud, in a room full of strangers, that my own son had tried to have me declared incompetent to steal my inheritance. What I hadn't prepared for was the woman in the 4th row who started crying before I finished the first 10 minutes. Afterwards, she found me. She was 72, small, with the tight posture of someone who had been holding themselves together through sustained effort. Her name was Dolores. Her daughter-in-law had been managing her finances for 8 months. She'd been told it was for her convenience, that it was easier this way, that she shouldn't worry herself with complicated things. "I knew something was wrong," Dolores said, "but I kept telling myself it was family. You don't call the police on your own family." "No," I said, "you don't. But you can call us." We got her connected with a legal advocate that afternoon. The situation was salvageable. Not perfectly, not without loss, but it was salvageable, which it would not have been in another 6 months. I thought about that a lot in the weeks after. 6 months. The difference between something you can fight and something you can only mourn. I will not tell you that Vanessa faced swift and complete justice, because that is not how these things work, and I refuse to give you a cleaner version of reality than what actually happened. What I can tell you is that the Attorney General's investigation resulted in charges: fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Gerald Foss surrendered his law license. The process took the better part of 2 years, moved through continuances and motions, and all the deliberate slowness of a system that was built for thoroughness rather than speed. By the time it concluded, Vanessa had negotiated a plea arrangement that involved restitution and a suspended sentence, which was not the full consequence I might have wished for. But her name was on a public record now, attached to what she'd done, and that mattered more than I'd expected it would. The apartment in Portugal, I later learned, had been rented on her credit and not mine. The furniture in the master bedroom had been returned as part of the restitution order. These were small satisfactions, and I allowed myself to have them without pretending they were larger than they were. Regarding Daniel, this is the part I've thought about most carefully, because it is the part people most want resolved. And resolution, real resolution, the kind that actually sticks, is almost never what people imagine when they want it. He wrote me letters. Not emails, letters. Handwritten, mailed to the Millhaven address I'd given Patricia. The first one arrived about 4 months after he'd left the house, and I didn't open it for 2 weeks. I kept it on the kitchen counter and walked past it every morning and thought about what might be in it and what I was willing to do with it. When I finally opened it, it was not an apology designed to move me. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't explain himself in ways that seemed calculated to minimize. He wrote about what he'd been doing. He'd started attending a therapy group for people dealing with the consequences of harmful relationship patterns, which was described with the careful lack of self-pity of someone who understood that the therapeutic process was not an achievement to be reported, but a debt being slowly paid. He'd taken a position with a firm in another city. He'd been sober for 3 months, which I hadn't known he needed to be. and which told me something about the months with Vanessa that I hadn't fully understood. He said, I have been trying to understand the specific point at which I started choosing not to know things. I think it started before Vanessa. I think she found something that was already there, and she used it, and that doesn't make what I did your fault or hers instead of mine. It just means the work is deeper than I thought. I read that paragraph 4 times. I wrote back. Not warmly. I wasn't there yet, but I wrote back. Short, careful, the way you test the structural integrity of something before you put weight on it. I said I had received his letter and I was glad he was in therapy and I needed more time. That was all. More letters came. Over the following year, we built something. I can't call it a reconciliation. That word is too large and too permanent for what it actually was, which was more like 2 people learning to be in the same correspondence without it being painful. He came to Millhaven once, a year and a half after the hearing. I invited him for a single afternoon. We walked the lake path and I showed him the cottage and we had lunch at Pete's coffee shop and talked about ordinary things. His work, my work, a book we'd both happened to read, and did not talk about the things that were still too close to touch. He left at 4 o'clock. At the door of his car, he said, I know I don't get to say I'm proud of you, but I want you to know I think about what you built, and it matters. What you're doing matters. I said, I know. He drove away and I stood in Pete's parking lot and watched until I couldn't see the car anymore. I felt many things. None of them were simple. Some of them hurt, even now, even after everything. That is the truth about certain kinds of wounds. They don't go away entirely, they just become something you carry more easily, something that hurts less often and less sharply, until one day you realize you have walked a whole week without feeling it. That day came, slowly, unevenly. It came. I am standing on my porch now, the porch of the Millhaven cottage that I bought outright in the 2nd year, when the rental landlord decided to sell and I decided not to lose another house to someone else's choices. The lake is doing the thing it does in early morning when the light is low and the water is still. This particular shade of silver blue that I have never been able to describe accurately to anyone who hasn't seen it. The drip in the kitchen faucet has been fixed for 2 years, but I still hear it sometimes in the space between sounds, that old steady rhythm, and I think of that first night and the woman I was in it, cold and uncertain and beginning something she couldn't fully see yet. I want to talk to you now, directly, because if you have been with me through all of this, through the rain and the courtroom and the letters and the long quiet work of rebuilding, then I owe you something more than a story. I owe you the thing underneath it. Here's what I know. I know that love used as leverage is not love. The moment someone uses your love for them as a tool to extract compliance, to manage your behavior, to make you feel that questioning them is a betrayal of the relationship, that is not love operating. That is control dressed in love's clothing, and the disguise is convincing precisely because you have real feelings to exploit. I nearly lost everything to that confusion. I signed documents I shouldn't have signed because I love my son and love told me to trust. I swallowed pills I should have questioned because love told me that my daughter-in-law's concern was genuine. Love, unexamined, made me easy to use. Love that demands you stop asking questions is not love. Hold on to that. I know that the people who tell you that you're no longer capable of managing your own life are often the people who have the most to gain from you believing it. I let that voice get inside my head for months. I started to wonder if they were right, if I was slipping, if the slowness I felt was my mind rather than the medication they were choosing for me. Self-doubt in a grieving person is not weakness. It is the completely natural result of losing your anchor. But it is also exactly what certain people look for. The woman who doubts herself is easier to move than the woman who trusts her own judgment. Trust your judgment. Get it checked by people who have nothing to gain from it being wrong. I know that setting a boundary with someone you love does not mean you love them less. Telling Daniel to leave my house was one of the hardest things I have ever done. It was also one of the most necessary. Protecting yourself from someone's harmful behavior is not a rejection of them. It is a refusal to allow the relationship to exist on terms that destroy you. Sometimes love means saying, not like this, not on these terms. Come back when you can do this differently. That is not coldness. That is clarity. And clarity is a form of respect for yourself. And if you mean it, for the other person too. I know that age does not diminish your right to your own life. I was 68 years old, standing in the rain with a suitcase, and there were people who looked at my age and my grief and my confusion and decided those things made me a target. They were almost right. But what they miscalculated was this. Age also means 42 years of a man who loved me enough to think ahead. It means a lifetime of knowing myself, even when grief made that knowledge temporarily inaccessible. It means decades of being someone who had gotten through hard things before. And that history doesn't disappear when your hair goes gray. Your age is not your vulnerability. It is, in fact, a very large part of your strength. And I know this, finally. Richard did not save me. I want to be precise about that, because the story could be told in a way where the dead husband is the hero and the widow is the beneficiary of his protection, and that version is not accurate. Richard built a structure. He left tools. He thought ahead with the love and the clarity that were the best of him. But I am the one who got up from that motel bed. I am the one who walked into Warren Elfield's office. I am the one who sat across from my son in a living room and said what needed to be said without softening it into something manageable. Richard gave me the materials. I built with them. There is a difference, and it matters, because you may not have a Richard. You may not have a blue card in a nightstand drawer, or a trust or an attorney who is already waiting for you. What you have always had, is yourself. The version of yourself that knows when something is wrong, even when you're being told it isn't. The version that gets up. The version that walks into the office or the bank or the courtroom or the conversation that needs to happen. That version doesn't require a Richard to exist. She just requires you to listen to her when she speaks. The lake is brightening now. The silver is going to gold the way it does when the sun finally clears the tree line, sudden and complete, and the whole surface changes in a moment. I have watched this happen every morning for 2 years, and it still gets me. Some things don't become ordinary no matter how many times you see them. Dolores called last week. She is well. The legal process for her situation concluded in the fall, and she has moved into an apartment she chose herself, in a building with a garden she tends with the same stubborn attention I give to my shore walks. She has become one of our volunteer peer counselors, which means she talks to women who are where she was, confused, afraid, not sure if what they're experiencing is real or if they're the problem. And she tells them, in the specific language of someone who has been exactly there. It is real, you are not the problem, and there is help. That is the other thing Richard left me. Not just the money, not just the legal protections, not just the letter in his careful handwriting. He left me the knowledge of what it felt like to be protected by someone who had planned for your survival. And from that knowledge came the need, the specific, focused, non-negotiable need, to make sure that protection wasn't only for women lucky enough to have husbands who thought ahead. The Harper Initiative serves older adults across 4 states now. We have a legal partnership with 11 law firms. We have trained advocates in 42 community centers. Last year, we helped prevent financial exploitation in 63 cases before the damage became irreversible. 63 people who made a phone call or walked into a seminar or printed a checklist from our website and recognized something in time. I think about Margaret Holt on the days when the work is hard. I think about the soup she made me and the kitchen where she tried to explain what had happened to her and couldn't fully find the words for it because there weren't good words yet, because nobody had named it clearly enough to give her the language. We are building that language now. We are naming it. We are making it something people can recognize before it is finished happening. That is what I do with my mornings now, beside the lake and the town with the construction project that is still almost finished. That is what Richard's money built in the end. Not security, not comfort, not a quiet old age tucked away somewhere private, something that will outlast me. I stand on my porch until the gold light reaches the middle of the lake, and then I go inside and make coffee and start the day. There are emails to answer and calls to return and a board meeting next week that Patricia says will be challenging, which means she has already identified 3 specific problems and is giving me time to prepare. My back still hurts on cold mornings. The faucet is fixed, but the heating system occasionally makes a sound it shouldn't. None of this is perfect. None of it needs to be. The woman who was pushed out into the rain one November night with a single suitcase, She is still in here. She is the one who knows what this cost. She is the reason I don't take any of it lightly. She stands behind everything I do now, not as a wound, but as a witness. As proof that the ground can hold after everything you thought was under you has given way. She is the reason I know, with the specific certainty of lived experience, that being broken open is not the same as being broken. And if you are watching this, wherever you are, in whatever city you typed in the comments at the beginning, if something in this story has landed close to something in your own life, I want you to hear this directly from me. You are not too old to fight. You are not too confused to know when something is wrong. You are not obligated to sacrifice your dignity on the altar of keeping the peace. The people who love you for what they can take from you do not love you. And the life you have earned, every year of it, every hard thing you survived to get here, belongs to you. Protect it like Richard taught me to protect mine. Build your blue card. Know where it is. And when the time comes, if the time comes, use it without apology and without hesitation. The lake is fully gold now, end to end. Another morning, entirely mine. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I know that age does not diminish your right to your own life. I was 68 years old, standing in the rain with a suitcase, and there were people who looked at my age and my grief and my confusion and decided those things made me a target. They were almost right. But what they miscalculated was this. Age also means 42 years of a man who loved me enough to think ahead. It means a lifetime of knowing myself, even when grief made that knowledge temporarily inaccessible. It means decades of being someone who had gotten through hard things before, and that history doesn't disappear when your hair goes gray. Your age is not your vulnerability. It is, in fact, a very large part of your strength. And I know this, finally. Richard did not save me. I want to be precise about that because the story could be told in a way where the dead husband is the hero and the widow is the beneficiary of his protection, and that version is not accurate. Richard built a structure. He left tools. He thought ahead with the love and the clarity that were the best of him. But I'm the one who got up from that motel bed. I am the one who walked into Warren Elfield's office. I am the one who sat across from my son in a living room and said what needed to be said without softening it into something manageable. Richard gave me the materials. I built with them. There is a difference, and it matters, because you may not have a Richard. You may not have a blue card in a nightstand drawer, or a trust, or an attorney who was already waiting for you. What you have, what you have always had, is yourself. The version of yourself that knows when something is wrong, even when you're being told it isn't. The version that gets up. The version that walks into the office, or the bank, or the courtroom, or the conversation that needs to happen. That version doesn't require a Richard to exist. She just requires you to listen to her when she speaks. The lake is brightening now. The silver is going to gold the way it does when the sun finally clears the tree line, sudden and complete, and the whole surface changes in a moment. I have watched this happen every morning for 2 years, and it still gets me. Some things don't become ordinary no matter how many times you see them. Dolores called last week. She is well. The legal process for her situation concluded in the fall, and she has moved into an apartment she chose herself, in a building with a garden she tends with the same stubborn attention I give to my shore walks. She has become one of our volunteer peer counselors, which means she talks to women who are where she was, confused, afraid, not sure if what they're experiencing is real or if they're the problem. And she tells them, in the specific language of someone who has been exactly there, it is real, you are not the problem, and there is help. That is the other thing Richard left me. Not just the money, not just the legal protections, not just the letter in his careful handwriting. He left me the knowledge of what it felt like to be protected by someone who had planned for your survival. And from that knowledge came the need, the specific, focused, non-negotiable need, to make sure that protection wasn't only for women lucky enough to have husbands who thought ahead. The Harper Initiative serves older adults across 4 states now. We have a legal partnership with 11 law firms. We have trained advocates in 42 community centers. Last year, we helped prevent financial exploitation in 63 cases before the damage became irreversible. 63 people who made a phone call or walked into a seminar or printed a checklist from our website and recognized something in time. I think about Margaret Holt, on the days when the work is hard. I think about the soup she made me in the kitchen where she tried to explain what had happened to her and couldn't fully find the words for it because there weren't good words yet, because nobody had named it clearly enough to give her the language. We are building that language now. We are naming it. We are making it something people can recognize before it is finished happening. That is what I do with my mornings now, beside the lake and the town with the construction project that is still almost finished. That is what Richard's money built, in the end. Not security, not comfort, not a quiet old age tucked away somewhere private. Something that will outlast me. I stand on my porch until the gold light reaches the middle of the lake, and then I go inside and make coffee and start the day. There are emails to answer and calls to return, and a board meeting next week that Patricia says will be challenging, which means she has already identified 3 specific problems and is giving me time to prepare. My back still hurts on cold mornings. The faucet is fixed, but the heating system occasionally makes a sound it shouldn't. None of this is perfect. None of it needs to be. The woman who was pushed out into the rain one November night with a single suitcase, she is still in here. She is the one who knows what this cost. She is the reason I don't take any of it lightly. She stands behind everything I do now, not as a wound, but as a witness. As proof that the ground can hold after everything you thought was under you has given way. She is the reason I know, with the specific certainty of lived experience, that being broken open is not the same as being broken. And if you are watching this, wherever you are, in whatever city you typed in the comments at the beginning, if something in this story has landed close to something in your own life, I want you to hear this directly from me. You are not too old to fight. You are not too confused to know when something is wrong. You are not obligated to sacrifice your dignity on the altar of keeping the peace. The people who love you for what they can take from you do not love you. And the life you have earned, every year of it, every hard thing you survived to get here, belongs to you. Protect it like Richard taught me to protect mine. Build your blue card, know where it is, and when the time comes, if the time comes, use it without apology and without hesitation. The lake is fully gold now, end to end. Another morning, entirely mine. I wouldn't trade it for anything.